morning I'd never preached on this text. But I must tell you that my mother would be proud of me for preaching on this text because she was an Eastern Star. How many of you were Eastern Star? A few of you. You know this text is one of the programmatic texts that Eastern Star uses. It is a book which is a wonderful narrative. It's about Ruth, King David's great-grandmother. And that's one of the reasons it's in our Bible. But I suspect another reason it's in our Bible is to provide a counter message to the xenophobia that's expressed in Ezra and Nehemiah. There's much about this book that we could talk about, but my wife would begin to tell me I'm lecturing rather than preaching. So I'm going to just give you a couple of interesting notes, and then we're going to get to work here. One of the interesting things about this book is that each of the names in the book has a meaning to it. Naomi is a name which means my joy. And Elimelech is a word which means my God is king. Both of the two sons who died, Mahlon and Chilion, have names that suggest they're not going to survive. Mahlon, it comes from a root that means to blot out, and Chilion comes from a root that means to perish. And Ruth is a name whose root word means friend. So all of these names have meaning. And one of the fascinating parts of this narrative is that this is one of the books of the Bible where there's not a single person in the narrative who acts dishonorably. They all behave in honorable ways. But now to the sermon. One of the lessons, I believe, of this text for us is a theme which runs throughout the Bible, that God is no respecter of persons. That is to say, it's not because you're of a certain tribe or nation or race that you are favored. God favors all of his children. You see, Ruth, for whom the book is named, is a Moabite. And the Moabites were despised by the Hebrews. All you have to do is go back in the Bible in the pew to Genesis chapter 19, verse 30 following, and you'll see about the origin of the Moabite nation and the Ammonite nation, and the heading of that section is the shameful origins of Moab and Ammon. In other words, this was a tribe that the Hebrews looked down on. Ruth was a Moabite. And it is a reminder, since she is in the genealogy of King David, that even those who are outside the tribe are valued in the plan of God's salvation. Jesus reminds us of this in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is not a good Jew, but a Samaritan who is the hero of the story. And in Acts chapter 10, Peter has to learn that God's plan includes more than just the Jews, but also the Gentiles by encountering Cornelius, the centurion. And in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, it is not an accident that two people who are outside of the tribe of Israel are included in the genealogy. One of them is Ruth, and another is Rahab. God is no respecter of persons. And so it begs the question of us, do we live up to that standard? The sad truth is the church has often failed in living up to that standard. There have been racial barriers in our churches. Someone has said, and I believe it's probably still true, that Sunday morning at 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour in our nation. There are social barriers that separate us from others who might join our fellowship. Many churches become a ghetto of sameness in the midst of a diverse culture. One of the places one of the congregations that I have encountered that still stands out in my mind because of its diversity and inclusiveness is the United Methodist congregation in Princeton, New Jersey. I worshiped there while I was doing my doctoral work at Princeton, and it was a profoundly diverse congregation. that was wonderfully inclusive, and the fellowship was a joy. In fact, after one of Sunday morning sessions there, one of my fellow students, who was, of course, a Presbyterian, said to me jokingly, "Well, did you have your heart strangely warmed?" And I said I certainly did, because the fellowship at that congregation was something to warm the heart. Ruth and all the others remind us that God is no respecter of persons, and that all are invited to God's banquet. The primary reason that Ruth stands out in our mind, however, is because it talks about a very special relationship between Ruth and Naomi, an enduring friendship between Ruth and Naomi. It reminds us of that friendship later on in the narrative between David and Jonathan. This is a friendship that was not prescribed by any kind of religious rule or by any custom of the day. You see, Orpah, who went back to her people, didn't violate any custom or any rule of the day. But Ruth and Naomi had a profound friendship and a trust which was lifelong. Now, I feel a little bit sad that in our day and age, the word friend has been devalued. You know, when it switched from being a noun to a verb, now people friend each other on Facebook. Someone once said to me, "I have 200 friends." And I felt like laughing, because they have 200 very superficial relationships. Friendship in the ancient world was a very important relationship, because in an age of arranged marriages and extended family households, a friendship was unique because it was a relationship of choice. You chose to be a friend with another person. And you yourself can name many examples of friendships that have enduring bonds. For example, people who suffer together often have lifelong bonds. My father died in 1973, but my mother continued to get correspondence from someone that was in the 101st Airborne Division with him in World War II. Those bonds don't go away when you have suffered together, even after 30 years pass. Many form these kind of special bonds when they travel life's road together. I know many people who are friends because their children and the children of others went through school together, and they kind of did that journey of parenting together and formed lifelong friendships. I want you to think for a minute about the friendship ties that you've experienced in your life. And then I want you to begin to think about the fellowship of the church. Someone has said that in the Christian faith, water is thicker than blood. That is to say, the waters of baptism become more important to us than kinship ties. And for those who participated in Wesley's early class meetings, or those who are in an accountable discipleship group, or others in the group are concerned about your soul, you understand how important these friendships can be. In one of the congregations I served, there were a group of persons who literally had no family. There was no person living to whom they were related, but they became a family together and celebrated holidays together, just as if they were a part of the same household. Those friendships were enduring and sustaining. And I'd like you to think for a minute, for many of us, our kin live far away, and the reality is that our Christian friends have more contact with us on a weekly basis than our extended family do. These relationships of friendship inside the church are very, very important to us. The word that's used throughout the book of Ruth about this is the word hesed. And that word is the same word that is used for the enduring quality and dependability of God's covenant with us. Those are the types of friendships that make a difference to us. And so near the end of the book of Ruth, Naomi says that the friendship and love of her daughter-in-law Ruth are better to her than having 7 sons. Jesus tells us in John 15, I have called you friends. Now, when these friendships that we have are so profound and important to us, the question comes up, what about death? Does that sever those bonds? We're going to be singing a closing hymn today, Shall We Gather at the River? It's number 723. And actually, I'd invite you to open your hymnal right now to 723. Reverend Lowry, who wrote Shall We Gather at the River, was a pastor in Brooklyn, New York, and there was an epidemic in the city, and many of his friends had gotten sick and died. And as he contemplated in his grief the fact that he and many of his friends had seen the river of death, he wondered if they would see together the river that is talked about in the vision of Revelation 22, the river that flows through by the throne of God, which is crystal clear. And I want you to look at the refrain. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful, beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Today, because of communion, we haven't followed our typical order of worship and included an affirmation of faith. But when we get to the point in the worship where we're singing the closing hymn, I would like you to sing that refrain as if it's an affirmation of faith, because it explains for us the affirmation that we have as children of God and believers in Jesus Christ, that in fact our friendships do not end. And on this All Saints Sunday, I want you to remember the saints you have known and the saints you do know as you sing that affirmation. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful, beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Amen.